We're going to be looking at the background of why really we regulate biotechnology and biosafety. And we're going to concentrate on the international agreement to which Egypt, including among other African countries, is a party. And looking at the background of the Cartagena Protocol, of course, it has its roots in Article 19.3 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. That article called parties to consider the need and modalities of coming up with a protocol that would really address appropriate procedures in the field of the safe handling, use of any LMOs that might have any adverse effects on biodiversity. The CBD really has three objectives, and those objectives are, for one, the sustainable use of its components, conservation of the biological diversity, and issues of equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the uses of genetic resources. The Cartagena Protocol really is one of the tools that is being used to implement the Convention on Biological Diversity. It deals specifically with issues that regulate, manage, or control risks, especially in the field of transfer, handling, and use of LMOs that you'll see this language of may have adverse effects on the conservation and sustainable use, and specifically focuses on transboundary movement. The Cartagena Protocol did take a long time to come into being. It took, if you look back in the 70s and the 80s, when biotechnology started being used in laboratories, then parties started thinking we need to come up with an international environmental agreement. But before we got there, countries specifically started looking at it within their own systems, and this led to an international working group that started looking at problem identification. What is this modern biotechnology going to do? Then from there they led to what we call the framework development, and they started the negotiations and defined what issues they wanted to deal with, and finally, in the final phase, we adopted the technology, the Cartagena Protocol in 2000. But really, so why? Why do we care? Why do we want to regulate biotechnology? Talking to policymakers and even listening to most of you today, you as scientists are challenged with the issue of looking at issues of poverty. You're looking at issues of hunger and issues of livelihoods, and yet you want to come up with a technology that will look at food security, issues of free trade, international markets, and also we want to conserve our biodiversity. But to do this, we need to come up with laws, and we need to come up with institutions that will be an acceptable trade-off between the competing and often conflicting interests. So we're trying to come up with a balance. That's why we're coming up with laws and regulations, to create a balance between addressing the livelihoods of our people while at the same time conserving our biodiversity. And that is a big challenge, and maybe that's why a lot of African countries today do not have their legal regulations in places. But we really need to look at this and address, and we need to come up with good governance systems, which at the moment are in their infancies, and they have not taken all these challenges on board. The other reason we need to regulate biotechnology is 45 African countries, as you'll see in my next slide, have signed the Convention on Biological Diversity and have also acceded to the Cartagena Protocol. And by doing so, they have bound themselves to come up with national regulatory systems that will ensure the adoption and the safe use of this technology, especially with regard to the transboundary movement of the same. Africa also gave itself a challenge and adopted what the Africa Union Model Law on Safety of Biotechnology, which was initially used by a lot of countries when dealing with GMO development and looking at biosafety. So those are the countries in Africa that have either ratified or acceded to the Cartagena Protocol. So by doing so, they have bound themselves to come up with national regulatory systems that will address the handling of this technology. Therefore, there is actually a need to come up with functional biosafety frameworks that will be participatory in approach and will be transparent, because what has been said as a challenge to scientists and regulators and policymakers is that we are not transparent enough, so that we have not opened ourselves to the public so that they understand what we do and so that they can embrace the technology. In societies where this technology has worked, what you will realize, the public trust their scientists, the public trust their policymakers, and the public trust their regulators, to the fact that, to the end that when they do so, they are able to come up with a technology and there's no major challenge. But in Africa, we still have issues of coming up with transparency. So coming up with laws will challenge you, of scientists, to become more transparent and have issues of public participation. So just briefly, I'll go to the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. It is an agreement under the CBD. The negotiations were completed in 2000, and it came into effect in 2003, and to date 162 countries have ratified. Its purpose really was to come up with a common and coordinated approach among countries that would address potential risks of LMO, and the word here is potential. And also it was to provide a degree of certainty in the field of biosafety regulation, trying to come up with what we call a level of uniformity. But this has still not been achieved, because when you look at so many laws in the region, you'll realize the divergence. Then it was also an issue that needed to balance trade, the needs of trade, the potential benefits, and at the same time protect the environment. The objective of this protocol is really to ensure the safe transfer, the handling, and the use of living modified organisms that may have an adverse effect on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, while at the same time taking into account risks to human health and specifically focusing on transboundary movement. So the key concepts to this protocol: it applies to transboundary movement. So if anything is coming through your country, into your country from another country, the Cartagena Protocol, it applies to issues of transit and the handling and the use of living modified organisms. It specifically deals with LMOs produced through modern biotechnology. It addresses effects on conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and it takes into account risks to human health. And in its preambular part, discusses the precautionary approach. It deals with a new concept that came into the Biosafety Protocol, which is called the Advanced Informed Consent Procedure. So where a party, and please remember it is a party, so it is not an organization. It has to be Egypt applying to Kenya, let's say for instance, applies for a first transboundary movement of an LMO that will be intentionally introduced into the environment, then Egypt will need to notify the competent authority in Kenya. And the competent authorities are all posted in the Biosafety Clearinghouse. Then it deals with, then Egypt will also need to do a risk assessment, have to show the competent authority that it has come with ways of risk management, and then we're going to have a decision by the competent authority from the other side. The Advanced Informed Agreement is really a science-based pre-authorization before any LMO can be introduced into the environment. And this here, we're looking at issues of commercial release and not confined field trial or contained use trials. When you look at the risk assessment in the Cartagena Protocol, it actually urges parties to come up with a process that will help them identify and evaluate the potential and adverse effects of GMOs. GMOs, LMOs are used interchangeably in this presentation. It encourages parties to use data and analysis in a scientific manner to identify and determine the likelihood of any potential risk. The risk assessment is carried out on a case-by-case basis. And you cannot say we approved this, so you can give us an approval if you're looking at it from a different angle. So it's on a case-by-case basis. A party could opt not to undertake a risk assessment if they feel comfortable enough with the risk assessment that had already been carried out on another approval. The risk assessment is actually conducted by both the applicant and the government based on data submitted by an applicant. Risk management is also an issue that is addressed in the Cartagena Protocol, and it just establishes appropriate mechanisms and measures and strategies to regulate, manage, and control risks that have been identified in your risk assessment, and all the geographic restrictions on planting of a GMO, the planting requirements, and the confinement conditions. When it comes to LMOs for food, feed, and processing, and this really deals with issues of food aid, then any decision that will be made by an exporting country should be posted in the Biosafety clearinghouse. The importing country can take a decision consistent with its domestic regulatory framework. Here, if a country chooses to carry out risk assessment, that will be based on its own domestic regulatory framework. But there is no need of the process that I've just explained when it comes to advanced informed consent. So if you look at the Biosafety Protocol, I've just tried to break it down. Its handling, transport, packaging, and identification is also an issue that is dealt with. Posting information in the Biosafety clearinghouse, dealing with confidential information where an applicant feels that I have intellectual property issues that I do not want to be revealed to the public during the public participation process, then that is also addressed in the Cartagena Protocol. And of course, the most difficult issue also that is now I see countries grappling with is the issue of public participation. That is also addressed in the Cartagena Protocol. If we look at the Cartagena Protocol really in a nutshell, it does not define what it does. It talks of being a protocol on biosafety, but it doesn't give us a definition on biosafety. So that leaves to nations to define what biosafety is. And my understanding, I'm not a scientist, I think biosafety has different meanings depending on the context in which it's going to be applied. We look at the protocol seeking to protect biological diversity from potential risks. And if I look at biosafety, it's in the protocol, it's very narrow because it doesn't address all risks, damages, issues that surround GMO. But it does not bar you, the Cartagena Protocol, from going to go and define within your national law what you feel comfortable. And I'm trying to rush because I have to get to a very important supplementary protocol that has come about after this protocol. So if you want to deal with domestically produced LMOs, you have to ensure when you're domesticating the Cartagena Protocol, then you address issues of domestically produced LMOs, because the Cartagena Protocol only deals with the transboundary movements of LMOs. So if you look at just an example I've given you, that when you're importing engineered seed from the US or from China, then that would be covered. But if you're moving from Giza to Alexandria, then you have to put that within your national law, how you want that to be handled. I will not go through this slide, but I will just put it there so that you can see the issue of products thereof, or products made from LMOs. Those are not covered under the protocol. I have seen other countries have included that. It is up to you within your national system. However, you should be looking at, I'm giving an example here, when it's an engineered tree, but a piece of wood or furniture that has been developed from that engineered tree, do you want it to be covered? You have to know, if you're going to include product thereof in your law, you have to really know what you want it to say. So it's clarity. Okay, so we have covered that, and I want to get that the protocol is actually an environmental agreement. And what it does, it addresses impacts to biological diversity, period. When you want to deal with food safety issues, then you go to Codex standards. Those are not addressed in the Cartagena Protocol. And it's good, so maybe when you've been listening to the scientists talking or to different communicators talking, maybe why they have not been dealing with the issue of food safety, because food safety is a Codex issue. It is not a biosafety issue, and it's not addressed in the Cartagena Protocol. And if you're looking at worker safety issues also, on issues of liability and redress, those are not addressed in the Cartagena Protocol. This is another area that is now very gray, and it's becoming active and alive, and I see it coming into the next COP meeting, the issue of socioeconomic considerations. Socioeconomic considerations is an issue that is currently being debated through the Conference of Parties process, because initially it was parties may take into account, it still is consistent with your international obligations, socioeconomic considerations that arise from the impact of LMOs on the conservation, sustainable use of biological diversity, especially with regard to the value of biological diversity to indigenous and local communities. Unfortunately, again, the Cartagena Protocol did not tell us what socioeconomic considerations are there, and they do vary from country to country. So this is an issue that is going to be debated in the COP. So this is now the new supplementary protocol on liability and redress. And it does the same thing as the Cartagena Protocol, has the same objective. It has the same scope as its parent protocol. But the supplementary protocol, which deals with liability and redress, really, I think, left parties in a bit of a challenge, because I think parties wanted to come up with international rules on liability and redress that would address liability and redress. But looking at this protocol, it doesn't do that really. It tells you go back to your domestic law. It contains 18 references to domestic law. And generally what it tells you, if your domestic law addresses all the specific elements within the supplementary protocols, then you may choose as a party to apply existing domestic law. Egypt has not signed this protocol as of yet. And if you feel your domestic law does not address all issues, then you could amend or develop domestic law to address those issues. It comes up with a different concept of the law, which we call it the administrative approach when it comes to addressing harms. The parties to the supplementary protocols will then be able to require operators, and it defines who an operator is, to take certain actions in the event of damage. The first thing that the person is supposed to do is to inform the competent authority, evaluate the damage, and then take response measures. That is the competent authority. Once the competent authority does that, once they have identified the operator who has caused the damage, they have evaluated the damage, and they have taken the appropriate response measures, they can clean up and then follow up through the courts to get their compensation from the operator. So any decisions requiring response measures should be reasoned, however, and include the opportunity for administrative or judicial review. It defines damage. It's the first multilateral environmental agreement that actually defines what damage is. I will not read that, but that is the definition of what damage is. Issues of traditional damage, issues where you get injured or where you die, unfortunately are not addressed. That's what we call traditional damage. What it says is you can go back to your domestic law and look at it. If it works, then you could address it through there, or you could come up with something new. When it comes to environmental damage, you should provide within your domestic law for rules and procedures to address the damage, and whether you should come up with response measures, or and whether the same have been addressed in your existing law. So I'm going to leave you with questions as Egypt today when it comes to to either, I understand you're in the process of looking at your biosafety regulations of your biosafety law. These are the issues. First of all, with the supplementary protocol, you're going to ask yourself if you want to sign that, and you want to look at what systems you already have in place, what type of systems do you want your law to cover, and whether your law already as it is covers what exists already, and then what damage are you really concerned about? If you have, and if you're coming up with a national system, you need to make sure that you're addressing not only imported products, but also domestically produced products. You come up with proportionate risk-based reviews. So I understand you're in the process of setting up your system. You want to ask yourself the following questions, which I'm not going to ponder, but because this presentation is going to be left with you, you can look at it and address it as a country. I thank you for listening.